Thanks. And so maybe, I don't know about Cedar Falls, but there are some areas of the country where you don't let it be known. In fact, we have all met atheists and agnostics, but we just don't know it. Not many of them wear these A pins like I'm wearing, the Richard Dawkins A pin. Because if you're running a business, you don't want that to be known. If your kids are in school, you may not want it to be known, depending on where you live. Some free thought families are very brave, and they don't care, and they'll stand up, and they'll fight, and they'll risk. In fact, they'll risk harm. There's actually harm that comes to some of these families. So we didn't have any teeth. We couldn't make a real complaint in that county. But our attorney, Rich Bolton, was looking at this, and he said, this is actually a national day of prayer thing, and if this sheriff can't do it, how can the president be doing it? And Annie Laurie Gaylor, I'm married to her. We're co-presidents of the foundation and co-hosts of our national radio show. She said, yeah. Wow. Why don't we sue the president? We can certainly find some plaintiffs there. So we did some research, we did some study, we have some legal injury. We now have 2 full-time staff attorneys, and we looked at the law, we looked at the history, we went down and read the congressional record, we looked at the newspaper, we looked at the whole history of this thing, and we said, this is wrong. This shouldn't be happening. So we sued Bush and his press secretary, but then Obama was elected, and so the names had to change. So now we're suing Obama and the press secretary. Is it still Gibbs, or did Gibbs?
Still Gibbs.
Still Gibbs, okay.
Yeah.
So it was one of the hardest things we've ever done, the amount of work we had to put into that, the history, correcting the record, the precedents from Supreme Court cases, and so on. And we filed it in federal court, and on April 15th of last year, we got the news that Judge Barbara Crabb, a federal judge, ruled in our favor, that the National Day of Prayer is unconstitutional. That was on tax day. And there was a whole bunch of these Tea Party members at the Capitol having a deal that day on tax day. And by the way, we're not a political group or a partisan group. We actually have some Tea Party members in our group. We have a lot of Republicans. We have some conservatives in our group as well. We're not. I think most atheists are liberals, but it doesn't follow that if you don't believe in God, you're necessarily a liberal. We have in our group some anti-abortionists and pro-guns and pro-death penalty people, which to me sounds kind of weird, but that's that's freedom, right? That's freedom to think. And at our conventions, the table talk is very interesting. We all have different libertarians. So we had a couple communists in the group, and so we're not partisan, but a lot of the Tea Party people were using religious arguments. So we can complain about Democrats or Republicans or anyone else who are using religion to mix religion and government. So on April the 15th, the news came down, and you should have seen our staff after all those months of working. We hadn't even read Barbara Crabb's decision yet, but we were dancing all over the office, and it was pretty exciting. But we did know that Judge Crabb enjoined the President of the United States from issuing a National Day of Prayer proclamation because it's unconstitutional. But pending all the appeals, which meant that he could still do it last May the 6th. He could still go ahead and do it. Within 2 hours of that announcement coming down on April the 15th, the White House sent out a tweet. I doubt that Obama had a chance to read that opinion. He's a constitutional authority, right? He would know these things. I doubt that anybody there had a chance to actually read or analyze the judge's wonderful decision. But the White House sent out this tweet assuring everybody, in light of this decision, we assure you that we're still going to have the National Day of Prayer this year to assure and comfort Americans that they haven't lost their precious day to pray. Because how are they going to pray if the government doesn't hold their hand, right? So, and then they announced right away that they would appeal, and within about a week or 10 days, the administration appealed their loss to the 7th Circuit in Chicago. In December, last December, we had oral arguments in Chicago with a 3-judge panel. And before that time, briefs were filed. We filed our brief to the 7th Circuit. We didn't have to do much work because Judge Crabb did a wonderful job. If you want to read her decision, it's a good, in fact, there's some classes that make it required reading, along with the Jones decision out of Dover. Barbara Crabb's decision is really eloquent, and she disagrees with us about a lot of things. We think under God and the Pledge of Allegiance is wrong, but she doesn't. She thinks under God is okay. She thinks in God we trust on the money is okay. She thinks there's a place in America to acknowledge and accommodate religion. And we agree with that. You can acknowledge religion if you're not pushing it. You can accommodate religion. For example, chaplains in the military, as long as they are passively accommodating military members who might need a chaplain, but there's a good argument for acknowledging and accommodating religion, let's say. But Barbara Crabb, even though she disagreed with us about those things, she thought and thinks that the National Day of Prayer crosses the line. It's more than just an acknowledgement. It's more than just solemnizing an occasion, like what happened in the Marsh decision in Nebraska, which, by the way, the administration, Obama and his lawyers and the other side, have relied on heavily, a very narrow decision that allows legislative prayer at a state capitol within the legislature if it's not directed at the people and if it's non-sectarian. In other words, if it doesn't mention Jesus or any particular religion. That was allowed to stay. Well, everyone's taking that little decision and thinking it's a license, therefore, to do everything we want to. But she analyzed the Marsh decision, and Marsh is all they've got, and it's a bad decision, and it doesn't help them at all. So we had 7 groups file friend of the court briefs for us, amicus briefs, if you know what that is. These, in addition to the real brief that is filed, where you make your case, other groups who have an interest in the issue can ask to file their own brief too, to add information that might help. We had 7 different groups: the ACLU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, American Humanist Organization, Center for Inquiry, the American, I forget the exact name, the Jewish Committee for Religious Freedom, who knows what that group is called, whatever it is, and then the Southern Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Freedom. They filed a brief for us as well, and they touched on areas that the briefs can only be so long, so our brief was pretty much packed, and they added things to it. The United States of America has 6 or 7 briefs filed as well, including one from Judge Roy Moore. You know who that was? The 10 Commandments judge in Alabama, who got kicked out of office for putting that big 10 Commandments on the, Montgomery Capitol there. And of course the National Day of Prayer Task Force and some other groups, Alliance Defense Fund, filed briefs arguing, first of all, that we don't have standing. We can't sue over something like that. Who are we to challenge, the standing of that? Or then arguing, well, there's no coercion involved. There's no coercion, so what, what's involved? If there's no coercion, then how are you hurt? How are we atheists and non-believers? How are we hurt if the president gets up and proclaims the day of prayer? What's the big deal, right? Well, I would say, what's the big deal if he stopped it? If it's no big deal, what's the big deal? But of course it's a big deal to the religious right. And I know not all Christians are like this. Not all Christians are that eager to mix religion and government. A lot of them, including some evangelicals, like Greg Boyd, who's a Twin Cities megachurch pastor, who says outright, America's not a Christian nation, and when you mix religion and government, they both get dirty. Christianity, he says, should be argued with persuasion, not with the force of government, especially a government that has a military. And that's another big issue that we can't talk about tonight, religion and the military. And so there's a lot of moderate and even some evangelical Christians who agree with us that state and church should be kept separate, and it's good for the country that they're separate because it protects freedom. But when we went to oral arguments then in December, one of the judges, Judge Mannion, who doesn't have a good record on state-church separation, was asking our attorney, what's the big deal? There's no coercion. Nobody's forcing you to pray, right? Do you atheists feel like the government's got a gun to your head saying you must pray now? He's just issuing a proclamation calling all Americans to pray. And you don't have to. You can ignore it. And our attorney turned to Mannion and said, coercion has never been an Establishment Clause test. Coercion is not the test. The 10 Commandments in high school classrooms was ruled unconstitutional. Any student walking by the 10 Commandments is free to ignore it, right? But the Establishment Clause isn't based on coercion. It's based on endorsement. If it looks like the government is endorsing, promoting, pushing one religious viewpoint, or hindering that religious viewpoint, it would be just as bad for the president to get up and say, we're going to have a national day of cursing God because of Katrina. I mean, that would be just as bad. You can bet people would see the importance of state-church separation, right? If that were to happen. They would say, wait a minute. What business does the government have interfering with my religious views? The government has no business. So its neutrality is the real test. And Rich, our attorney, kept talking to Mannion. It's not coercion. Coercion is, look at all the precedent in the Supreme Court. Look at all the decisions. Coercion is not the test here. It's neutrality and endorsement. It's an endorsing, and the government has to be neutral. And our country is a great country because of the neutrality of government on religious issues, allowing all of us to believe, disbelieve, as we see fit. In America, we are free to disagree about religious matters. We are not free to ask our government to settle the argument. The government can't do that and shouldn't do that. The government should fold its arms and step back and say, hey, you argue among yourselves, talk among yourselves. The government, it only has secular civil powers. And actually that protects the religious powers, the clerical powers, from governmental intrusion. Because I don't think any church would want the government interfering with their business. By the way, we have another lawsuit that's under the radar right now, challenging the parsonage exemption that clergy get. Did you know that? A member of the clergy does not have to report their house payment or their rent as income. Lowers their tax liability. The rest of us have to. But for some reason, it was in the 1950s again, which is when Under God was put in the pledge in the 1950s, and when In God We Trust became our national motto in the 1950s. Also, this parsonage allowance was passed, which is unfair. It's giving an unfair advantage to members of the clergy. And the legislation at the time was to help the clergy fight our common enemy. Who was the common enemy? The godless communists, the godless Russians. So we're challenging that, and we think it will help. It will help the country economically, at least. I mean, what church is going to argue? Well, we need the break because our God's too poor. You know, we need. You know, what church is going to argue that, right? If I were running a church, I'd be embarrassed to admit that our God couldn't afford to pay the bills. We had to go begging from tax dollars in order to do our mission. Benjamin Franklin said earlier in his life, that's one sign that it's not a good religion. A good religion doesn't need the help of government. A good religion can do it on its own. But as soon as a religion wants the help or the blessing or the endorsement of the government, there's a sign that something's wrong with that religion. It's not a good religion. It's not cutting it. It's admitting that it can't do it without the help of all the taxpayers. So, we had oral arguments in December, and we're waiting for a decision. We might lose. We've got a 3-judge panel. Mannion and Easterbrook are not the best on these issues. Judge Williams, though, she was wonderful. She was really up on it. In fact, she was arguing with Mannion about this. She said, if coercion is the test, what if the government were to get up and say, America is officially a Catholic nation? You're not coerced. Nobody has to do that, but we're declaring America as a Roman Catholic nation. You would think it's getting close to that now. You know how many justices in the Supreme Court are Roman Catholics? Do you know how many there are? It's 6 of them now that are out of the 9. Sotomayor's Catholic, right? So, or is it 7 now? Who's left? Anyway, a majority. In a country that was founded, the Pilgrims and the Mayflower and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you know what their main reason was for founding their colonies in the United States and on America?
Religious persecution.
It was anti-communism. They were escaping religious persecution, but it was not communism, anti-Catholicism. But it is the same difference because the early church was communistic when you think about it. The early Christian church shared all their things. In fact, people who didn't share, who lied, were actually struck dead, Ananias and Sapphira. The early colonists in America were anti-Catholic. They hated the horror of Rome. They hated this whole Catholic thing. It took a long time for Catholics even to be considered a part of the fabric of our country, except in a few places. But now, Catholicism, of course, we realize is welcome. We would never think of going back and adopting those divisive views of the... Those weren't the founders, by the way. Our country was founded a century and a half later. Our country was founded in the 1770s, 1780s. And if we're going back to the Mayflower, why go back there? Why not go back to my ancestors, the Native Americans? We were on this continent 12,000 years ago. That was 6,000 years before the Earth was created. We were... Why think that this nation was founded by a few people, a few invaders